He left a $5 tip on purpose, hoping she'd curse him out. Instead, she ran into the freezing rain to give it back, and that single choice rewrote a $3 billion will before the night was over. Nobody warned Walter Kane that money attracts everything except loyalty. He had to learn that lesson himself, at 78 years old, lying in a hospital bed while his own children hovered outside the door like they were already measuring the drapes. They weren't waiting to say goodbye. They were waiting for him to stop breathing so they could start dividing. So on a gray Tuesday night, the billionaire disappeared. He didn't, his driver. He didn't, his lawyer. He put on a coat he'd bought secondhand for $9, and he walked into a diner on the edge of the city like a man with nowhere else to be. He wasn't hungry. He was hunting for something money couldn't buy. One person who would treat him like a human being instead of a bank account. He found her by accident, and by the time the night was over, he'd torn up 30 years of legal planning to make room for a stranger. The rain that night wasn't gentle. It came down sideways, drumming against windshields and turning the sidewalks into black mirrors. Walter Kane stepped out of the back of a taxi 3 blocks from his destination, paid the driver in cash, and pulled the collar of his coat up around his neck. The coat smelled faintly of mothballs and someone else's cologne. Underneath it, he wore a flannel shirt gone soft with age, and boots a size too big, borrowed from his groundskeeper's closet without asking. To the city, Walter Kane was a legend. Founder of Kane Industries. The man financial magazines called ruthless with something close to admiration. Net worth, north of $3 billion, though nobody, including Walter, could say the number with any real precision anymore. Tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight he was just an old man walking into a diner called the Blue Plate, coughing into his sleeve, carrying a secret that would kill him faster than any lawsuit ever could. The bell over the door gave a tired little jingle as he stepped inside. The place smelled like coffee that had been on the burner too long and bacon grease that had soaked into the walls years ago. It was mostly empty. A couple of night shift workers hunched over plates, a trucker reading something on his phone, a teenager doing homework in a corner booth. Walter chose a seat near the back, away from the window, and lowered himself into it with a groan that wasn't part of any performance. The cancer in his lungs was very real, and some nights it made itself known whether he wanted it to or not. "Be right there, Han," a voice called from across the room. He looked up to see a young woman moving fast, balancing 3 plates on one arm like she'd done it 10,000 times. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had clearly given up trying to stay neat hours ago. Her name tag read Maddie, slightly crooked, like she'd pinned it on in a hurry that morning. This was the 5th diner Walter had tried in the last month. At the first, he'd been ignored for 20 minutes because of how he was dressed. At the second, the waitress had rolled her eyes so hard he nearly heard it. At the third, the manager had asked him to leave before he'd even ordered. He was starting to believe the answer to his question was simply no. That kindness toward people who had nothing to offer in return had gone extinct somewhere along the way, replaced by the calculation of who was worth being nice to. Maddie dropped the plates at a nearby table, absorbed a comment from one of the men there with a tired but practiced smile, and turned toward Walter's booth. "Sorry about the wait. Nasty night out there. Can I start you with some coffee?" Walter, his eyes low. "Water. Tap's fine. A menu. Don't expect me to order the steak." It was an ugly opening line, deliberately so. Most people would have bristled. Maddie just smiled, an actual smile, the kind that reaches the eyes instead of stopping at the mouth. "We're fresh out of steak tonight anyway. Meatloaf's good though. I'll grab that water." She came back 30 seconds later. No ice, exactly as he'd asked, though he hadn't actually asked. She'd just noticed. "Straw," Walter said. "My shake." She produced one instantly, no comment, no look that lingered too long on his trembling fingers. "And this table's filthy," he added, running a finger across a sticky patch on the formica. Most servers would have sighed. Maddie pulled a rag from her apron without a word and scrubbed the spot until it squeaked. "Better?" she asked. "I know how much that drives people crazy. My dad's the same way. Can't stand a dirty table." "I'm not particular," Walter grumbled. "I'm old. Different thing." "Fair enough." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, not the customer service kind. "So, meatloaf, or are you a breakfast for dinner kind of guy?" "Coffee, black. Hi, if you have it. And heat it up. If it's cold, it's going back." For the next hour, Walter Kane did everything in his power to make Maddie's night miserable. He sent the coffee back twice, once too hot, once too weak. He complained the pie was too sweet, then too tart. He dropped his fork on the floor on purpose, twice, just to watch what she'd do. She never sighed. She never rolled her eyes. She was juggling 6 tables, a broken register, and a crying toddler tooths over, and every single time she circled back to him, she did it with the same patient warmth, like his booth was the only one that mattered. Walter found himself watching her instead of eating. His own daughter had once thrown a wine glass at a hotel employee because her room wasn't ready early enough. His son hadn't called him in 3 months except to ask for money. And here was this stranger, exhausted and underpaid, treating a rude old man like he deserved basic decency for no reason at all. When he finally signaled for the check, it came to $14 and change. He counted out a worn 20 from a Velcro wallet, making sure she saw the mix of small bills inside, mostly ones, a couple of fives, nothing that looked like real money. "Keep the change," she offered, reaching for the bill. "No, I need it broken." He pulled the 20 back before she could take it. She blinked, surprised, but nodded and disappeared toward the register. She came back with a 5 and 5 ones. Walter took the ones and left the 5 sitting on the table. A decent tip, generous even, if you didn't know the context. He'd occupied her table through the dinner rush, sent food back 3 times, and was now capping it off with a lie. "Service was slow," he said, standing, faking a limp he didn't need. "Pie was soggy, too." He walked toward the door without waiting for a response, bracing for the muttered insult he'd heard in every other diner. It never came. He stepped out into the rain and started counting his steps toward the corner where his car was waiting. 1, 2, 3. Sir. He stopped. Here it comes, he thought. Now she says what she really thinks. He turned around. Maddie was running toward him through the downpour in nothing but her thin uniform, already soaked, her hair plastered to her face. She was holding the $5 bill out toward him, dripping wet. "You forgot this." Walter stared at the bill, then at her. "I didn't forget it. Yours." She didn't, her hand back. Instead, she stepped closer, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, not gratitude but concern. "I saw your wallet," she said quietly. "Mostly ones. You ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and stayed inside a long time just to stay warm. I've been there. I know what that looks like." Walter went still. She thought he was homeless, stretching 1 cup of coffee into an hour of shelter from the storm. "I can't take this," she said, pressing the bill into his hand. $5 is a meal for somebody. Please." "I don't need your charity, girl," he said, the words coming out rougher than he meant them to. "It's not charity." She dug into her apron pocket and pulled out a small worn coupon. "This for breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. Expires tomorrow. I was gonna use it myself, but I want you to have it. Come in tomorrow morning. Ask for me. I'll make sure the coffee's actually hot this time." She smiled at him, that same real smile, then turned and jogged back toward the warm light of the diner before he could say another word. Walter stood alone on the corner, rain soaking through his cheap coat, the $5 bill, and the crumpled coupon feeling heavier in his hand than any contract he'd ever signed. She had seen straight through the disguise to something underneath it that even his own children refused to look at. A black car rolled up silently beside him, the window down. "Mr. Kane," his driver said, alarmed. "You've been out here 5 minutes. Are you all right?" Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the coupon one more time, then climbed into the back seat, the warmth of the leather doing nothing to touch the fire building in his chest. "Get me my phone," he said, and this time his voice had changed. The frailty was gone, replaced by the steel that had built an empire. He called his lawyer, a man named Elliot Reyes who had known him for almost 30 years. "I need you at the house tonight. Bring the will and shredder." "Walter, it's 10 at night, and that will took us 4 months to finalize. What happened?" "I found out I've been getting it wrong," Walter said, watching the diner shrink in the rearview mirror. "Bring everything. We're starting over." He hung up before Elliot could argue further, then dialed a second number, a private investigator he kept on retainer for situations exactly like this one. "I need a full background check," Walter said. "Name's Maddie. She waits tables at the Blue Plate on 5th Street. I want to know everything, family, debts, history. Tonight, if you can manage it." "Is she a problem, sir? Someone? Con?" Walter looked down at the coupon in his palm. "No, she's the first honest thing I've come across in 10 years. By morning, his children would know something had happened, and when people who consider an inheritance already theirs feel it slipping away, they don't go quietly. The penthouse felt more like a museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a skyline glittering below, and an emptiness that no amount of square footage could fix. Walter sat in his usual chair, an oxygen line looped over his ears, while Elliot Reyes stood across from him looking like he'd aged 5 years since the phone call. Between them sat the estate documents, hundreds of pages representing decades of careful planning, all of it designed to hand the company to Walter's 2 children, Grant and Diane, with the smallest possible tax burden. "Do it," Walter said. Elliot hesitated, his hand hovering over the shredder someone had wheeled in at his request. "Walter, please think about this. If something happens to you before we finalize a new will, this goes to probate. The state takes a huge cut. Everything gets picked apart in court." "Let them pick apart nothing, Elliot. I'd rather that than hand it to 2 people who've already started measuring my coffin." He coughed hard into a handkerchief, folding it quickly so his old friend wouldn't see the color on the fabric. "Grant hasn't called me in months except to ask for money for some gambling mess in Monaco. Diane moved my hospice nurse out of the main house because the smell of medicine bothered her guests." Walter's hand shook as he pointed at the shredder. "Feed it in." Elliot sighed and fed the first stack through. The grinding sound filled the room, oddly satisfying, 30 years of careful planning reduced to confetti in minutes. As the last page disappeared, the elevator chimed. A man in a damp trench coat stepped out, holding a manila envelope against his chest, the investigator moving faster than anyone expected. "That was quick," Walter said. "She's not hard to find, Mr. Kane. People like her don't hide, they just survive quietly." The investigator set the envelope down and opened it. The first item was a photo, a younger Maddie in a cap and gown, beaming, a real smile instead of the tired one from the diner. Graduated at the top of her class, got into a pre-med program on a partial scholarship, wanted to be a pediatric doctor. "She's pouring coffee," Walter said quietly, running his thumb over the photo. "She dropped out 3 years ago." The investigator pulled a second photo, a teenage boy in a wheelchair, thin and pale. "This is her younger brother, Sam. Serious heart condition, needs constant care. Their parents died in a car accident when Maddie was 19. She's had guardianship ever since." The room went quiet except for the soft hiss of Walter's oxygen tank. Insurance capped out 2 years ago, the investigator continued. State assistance covers the basics, but the specialized care runs close to $4,000 a month. She works doubles at the diner, cleans offices at night. She's over $100,000 in debt, and her landlord's already filed to evict them, 3 months behind on rent. Walter closed his eyes. He thought of the $5 bill sitting in his coat pocket. She had been drowning, and she still gave away money she didn't have to spare for a stranger she believed had less than her. Not anymore, Walter said, standing despite the dizziness that came with it. Elliot, get your notepad. We're writing something new tonight. Walter, you can't leave everything to a woman you met once. The courts will say you weren't of sound mind. Grant will bury her in litigation. I know, Walter said, and something that almost resembled a smile crossed his face. That's why we're not leaving it to her directly. We're going to be smarter than that. He looked down at the photo of Maddie and her brother. Find out who owns that apartment building, he told the investigator. I want it bought by morning. Cass. Sunrise didn't really arrive in the city that day, just a slow lightening of the same gray sky. In the private dining room of an exclusive club downtown, Grant Kane was having a meltdown that had nothing to do with his father's health and everything to do with a stock price. What do you mean he's not answering? Grant snapped into his phone, slamming a fist on the tablecloth hard enough to rattle the silverware. The investors are waiting. This deal is the only thing propping up the share price right now. On the other end, his father's assistant stammered an apology and no real answers. Grant hung up and turned to his sister Diane, who was picking at a plate of fruit with visible boredom. He's finally lost it, Diane said, adjusting an earring. We should have filed for power of attorney months ago. This isn't senility, Grant said. He shredded the will last night. Elliot was at the penthouse until 3 a.m, and there was an investigator there too. Diane's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. An investigator? Investigating who? I know. But if he's gathering information on someone, we need to know before this goes any further. Grant pulled out his phone and opened a tracking app most people didn't know existed. A blinking dot sat over a rundown stretch of the city. He's not at the office. He's not at the hospital. He's some diner. Maybe he's meeting a woman, Diane said, almost amused. He's 78 and on oxygen. Men are men, Grant. Especially the ones who know they're running out of time. Diane stood, wiping her mouth. If some waitress has her hooks in him, we need to see it for ourselves. 5 miles away, Walter sat in the same booth at the blue plate, freshly shaved, still wearing the thrift store coat, holding the coupon like it might disappear if he loosened his grip. You came back, Maddie said, appearing with a coffee pot, looking even more tired than the night before. Her eyes were faintly red, like she'd been crying at some point, and had willed it away before her shift. Didn't want to waste a coupon, Walter said gruffly. She poured his coffee, made sure this pot's fresh, scalding exactly how you like it. He actually laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. You're a smart-mouthed kid. Keeps me sane, she lowered her voice. Did you eat something last night? After you left? Walter felt something tighten in his chest. She was worried about him. I did. Thanks to you. She relaxed slightly, then glanced toward the kitchen. I shouldn't. Sit with you a second? Sit, he said. My eggs hurt. I hate eating alone. She slid into the booth across from him. I never told you my name properly. Maddie. Walter, he said, deliberately leaving off the last name. Why do you keep smiling, he asked her, when everything around you looks like it's falling apart? She looked down at her hands, chapped from hot water and dish soap. Because if I stop, I think I'll break. And Sam needs me not to break. Your brother. She nodded, blinking back tears before they could fall. Rough night. Bad episode around 2 a.m., had to rush him to the ER. He's stable, but the doctor says his lungs are getting weaker. She looked up, eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. He's teen. Never been on a real date. Never seen the ocean. All I can do is serve eggs and hope the tips cover the electric bill. She took a breath. So I smile because if I let myself be angry, the world wins. And I won't let it win. Walter studied her. The same fire he remembered having decades ago when he'd built his company out of nothing, except his had come from ambition and hers came from love. Then the front door slammed open, the bell rattling violently against the glass. "Dad." Walter closed his eyes for one brief second before turning. Standing in the doorway, soaked from the rain in their designer coats, were Grant and Diane. Grant's eyes moved from his father to Maddie, taking in the stained apron and the crooked name tag with open contempt. "So this is her," Grant said. "The mystery meeting." "Who are you?" Maddie asked, standing confused. Walter rose to his feet too, the frailty falling away, replaced by the posture of a man who had run boardrooms for 40 years. "My children have arrived. And they're just leaving." Grant laughed and stepped closer, invading the space around the booth. "Not until we understand why you're playing house with a waitress while the company's on fire." He turned to Maddie, pulling out a checkbook, clicking a pen. "Let's simplify this. How much to walk away and never say the name Kane again? 10,000? Maddie's face drained of color as the name landed. "Kane," she whispered. "Your company. The one on all the buildings." "Yes," Grant said, tearing off a check and slapping it on the table. "And you're done here. Take the money." Walter's hand moved faster than anyone expected, snatching the check off the table and tearing it in half. "Get out," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're making a mistake," Grant said, red-faced. "We're filing for a competency evaluation. We'll have you in a facility before you can hand a dime to this stranger." Walter didn't flinch. He called for his driver, a broad-shouldered man who'd been waiting quietly near the kitchen. "Escort them to the curb." The driver stepped forward, cracking his knuckles, and Grant and Diane retreated fast, Diane hissing a warning at Maddie on the way out. "Watch your back," before the bell jingled shut behind them. Silence settled over the diner. Maddie looked at the torn check, then at Walter, her voice shaking. "You lied to me. Pretended to be broke. Was this all some game to you?" "No," Walter said, his chest aching worse than the cancer ever had. "I was hungry, Maddie. I just didn't know what for until I met you." He left the coupon on the table and walked out into the rain, but he wasn't finished. Grant had made his move. Now it was time to protect the one honest thing Walter had left. That night, the power in Maddie's apartment building went dark. The landlord showed up with an eviction notice and an envelope of cash he wouldn't explain, citing a sudden code violation that required everyone to vacate immediately. Sam's ventilator battery dropped toward zero as Maddie scrambled in the dark, panic rising in her throat. Then her front door was kicked open, not by police, but by 3 men in rain gear who turned out to be sent by Walter himself, led by his own driver, who calmly explained that Grant had paid to have the power cut, and that Walter was trying to undo the damage before it was too late. Within minutes, a medical team had Sam stabilized and moving, and Maddie found herself in a convoy of black SUVs headed toward an estate on the water she never could have imagined entering. Sam was rushed into a private medical wing more advanced than anything seen outside of television, stabilized by a specialist who introduced himself with the calm confidence of someone who had never lost a patient like this. Maddie watched through a glass wall as machines she didn't recognize kept her brother breathing easily for what felt like the first time in months. "He's safe," Walter said from the doorway behind her, leaning on a cane, looking more fragile than he had in the diner, but somehow more certain of himself than ever. "You kidnapped us," Maddie said, though the anger in her voice had dulled into something closer to disbelief. "I got you out before my son finished what he started," Walter said. He lowered himself into a chair and pulled the $5 bill from his pocket, now worn soft from handling. "This is the most valuable thing I own. It's the only honest transaction I've had in a decade." "So what happens now? I save your family drama, take a check, and disappear?" "No," Walter said firmly. "I'm not leaving you money, Maddie. Money ruined my children. I'm leaving you something that matters, control of my foundation. It funds hospitals, research, scholarships, billions, assets. It needs someone who actually understands what it's like to have the lights cut off." Maddie stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "I'm a waitress. I didn't even finish college." "You kept a dying boy alive for 3 years on minimum wage with no help," Walter said. "You have more backbone than my entire board combined. If my son inherits this company, he'll gut the foundation for parts. He'll sell off the research that keeps kids like your brother breathing to whoever pays the most." Before Maddie could respond, his lawyer burst into the room, pale and holding a tablet. "Walter, Grant and Diane just filed an emergency motion. They're claiming you're mentally incapacitated and under the influence of a predator. They're pushing for immediate conservatorship. If it goes through tonight, every asset gets frozen, and anything you've changed in the last 2 days gets erased." Walter's face went stony. Maddie looked at him, no longer the powerful man from the boardroom stories, just an old man who had tried once to do something right, and was being punished for it by his own blood. "You can leave," Walter told her quietly. "Go out the back. Take whatever cash is in the safe. They won't chase you if your name isn't on anything." Maddie looked through the glass at her brother, sleeping peacefully in a bed better than anything she could ever have given him. She thought of Grant's sneer at the diner, the checkbook, the casual cruelty of people who had never once had to choose between rent and medicine. She took a breath and straightened her still-stained apron. "No," she said. "I'm not running." She stepped beside Walter's chair and put a hand on his shoulder. "Lock the gate. And call whoever you need to call. If they want to say you're incapable, let the world see exactly what you just did for a boy who isn't even yours." Walter looked up at her, something like relief breaking across his tired face. "The waitress is in charge," he said, and for the first time in years he laughed like he meant it. The hearing took place 3 days later. The courthouse swarmed with reporters after Grant and Diane leaked their version of events to anyone who'd listen. A story about a scheming caregiver and a confused old man losing his grip. Walter arrived in a wheelchair, breathing through an oxygen line, but dressed in his sharpest suit, Maddie at his side with her head held high despite the stares. Grant's lawyer painted a picture of manipulation and diminished capacity, asking the court to freeze every asset before more damage could be done. When it was Walter's turn to speak, he didn't reach for legal language. He reached into his pocket and held up the same worn $5 bill. "My son sees $5 and sees nothing worth bending down for," he told the courtroom, his voice weak but steady. "This woman saw a man she believed had nothing and gave him her own grocery money. That's not manipulation. That's the only real thing that's happened to me in 10 years." The judge denied the motion. Walter Kane died 6 days later, watching the sun go down over the water, holding Maddie's hand. His children received a sealed envelope containing a single $5 bill and a short note. "So you can buy some humanity. Don't spend it all in one place." Maddie inherited control of the Kane Foundation, with one condition written into the will, that it never lose sight of the people it was built to help. Today, the pediatric wing that bears her brother's name treats thousands of children a year, and in her office, framed on the wall, isn't a diploma or a stock certificate. It's a single, worn $5 bill. What Walter Kane discovered too late is something most people never have to learn the hard way, that the size of a bank account has nothing to do with the size of a person's character. His children had access to everything money could buy, and still came up empty where it counted. A tired young woman working double shifts to keep her brother alive had almost nothing, and gave away more than she could afford without a second thought. In the end, it was never really about the money at all. It was about who deserved to hold it. If a story like this makes you stop and think about the people you might be walking past every day, that's exactly the point. Kindness doesn't check a bank statement before it decides who's worth it. And more often than not, it finds its way back around when you least expect it.